Welcome to Mystery Stories, where quiet villages hide powerful secrets and gentle observations uncover the deepest truths. Tonight's tale, A House That Remembered Everything, invites you into a world of soft conversations, hidden pasts, and a mystery patiently waiting to be solved. Settle in, relax, and let the calm voice of storytelling guide you through a cozy journey where every small detail matters and nothing is ever truly forgotten. Chapter 1. The first sign that something had changed in Brackenshire came not from the house itself, but from silence. It was the sort of silence that settled awkwardly into conversation, arriving just half a second too late. Like a guest no one had invited, yet everyone noticed. Miss Marple became aware of it the very morning she arrived, seated comfortably beside the window of Mrs. Eliza Morton's sitting room, where weak autumn sunlight filtered through lace curtains and rested gently upon polished teacups. Mrs. Morton was speaking about roses. She had been speaking about roses for several minutes, yet her attention kept drifting toward the lane outside. Each time footsteps passed, she paused ever so slightly, listening. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully and waited. She had long ago learned that people revealed far more in pauses than in words. "It does feel different somehow," Mrs. Morton said at last, lowering her voice though no one else was present. Ever since the house reopened, Miss Marple lifted her eyes with mild curiosity. A house reopening is always an event in a village. Empty places gather stories rather quickly. Mrs. Morton leaned forward. "Ashcombe House, my dear. After 20 years. Imagine that." Miss Marple nodded politely, though she noted the faint tightening around her friend's mouth. Excitement alone did not produce such an expression. Outside, a delivery cart rattled past, and Mrs. Morton watched it go as if expecting it to turn toward Elderberry Lane. "And the new owner?" Miss Marple asked gently. "A gentleman named Hollywood. Adrian Hollywood. Very proper, very polite. Which somehow makes it worse." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Villages, she reflected, were always suspicious of excessive politeness. She said nothing more, allowing Mrs. Morton to continue, and within moments the story flowed freely, as stories always did when given patience. Mr. Hollywood had arrived quietly 3 weeks earlier. Workmen followed almost immediately. Curtains replaced, gardens trimmed, lamps glowing at night where darkness had ruled for decades. "But the strange thing," Mrs. Morton added, lowering her voice further, "is that the place hardly looked abandoned to begin with." Miss Marple's spoon paused mid-stir. "Oh, yes. Windows weren't nearly as dusty as one might expect, and the locks, all new now, of course, but someone said they'd been changed recently even before he arrived." Miss Marple set her cup down carefully. A maintained emptiness was rarely accidental. Houses left alone for 20 years did not quietly preserve themselves. Later that afternoon, they attended tea at the vicarage, an event Miss Marple found invaluable for understanding any community. The drawing room hummed with gentle chatter, porcelain clinking, and polite laughter that never rose too loudly. Yet beneath the pleasantness ran a current of alert curiosity. Ashcombe House entered conversation naturally enough when Mrs. Penberry mentioned seeing lights there after dusk. The effect was immediate. Mrs. Linton, seated nearest the fire, dropped a sugar cube back into the bowl with a soft clatter. Dr. Reeves cleared his throat and reached quickly for more tea, though his cup was already full. The vicar's wife changed the subject with remarkable speed, asking about church flowers. Miss Marple observed everything while appearing entirely absorbed in her sponge cake. "It must be lovely to see the old place alive again," she remarked mildly. A pause followed. "Yes," Mrs. Linton said too quickly. "Though one hopes the past remains the past," her tone carried something sharper than nostalgia. Miss Marple noticed her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her cup. "What past was that?" Miss Marple asked with innocent curiosity. "Oh, nothing of consequence," Mrs. Penberry said, clearly eager to speak despite herself. "Just that unfortunate accident years ago." The Ashcombe girl. Terribly sad, Mrs. Linton's spoon struck her saucer again. Miss Marple turned her attention gently toward Mrs. Penbury. Accidents are always sad, she said softly, especially in quiet places. She fell, Mrs. Penbury whispered, from the upstairs balcony. Clara Ashcombe. Such a lovely young woman. The room grew noticeably still. Dr. Reeves spoke abruptly. A tragic misstep. Nothing more. Miss Marple glanced at him briefly. His voice was firm, yet his eyes avoided everyone's gaze. People who insisted strongly upon simplicity often feared complication. And yet, Mrs. Penbury added, lowering her voice conspiratorially, some said she had argued with someone earlier that evening. The vicar's wife laughed nervously and began discussing jam recipes with exaggerated enthusiasm. Miss Marple took another sip of tea. Arguments before accidents, an old and familiar pattern. As the gathering ended, she noticed Mr. Halliwood himself standing outside the gate, speaking courteously with villagers as they departed. He was perhaps in his early 40s, neatly dressed, composed, his expression attentive without warmth. His gaze lingered briefly on each face, as though measuring reactions rather than greeting neighbors. When introduced, he bowed slightly. Miss Marple, I have heard you are visiting Mrs. Morton. I hope Brackenshire proves restful. His tone was pleasant, yet Miss Marple detected a faint strain beneath it, not nervousness but purpose. A village is always restful, she replied gently. Though never entirely uneventful, for just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or agreement. That evening, Miss Marple chose to walk along Elderberry Lane before supper. The air carried the scent of damp leaves and distant chimney smoke. Ashcombe House appeared gradually through the trees, its tall windows glowing faintly in the fading light. She paused by the gate. The iron latch shone with recent polish. The hinges moved silently when touched. New locks gleamed against old wood. She looked closer. The gravel path bore signs of frequent sweeping, not recent clearing, but regular care extending backward in time. Ivy had been trimmed months before, not weeks. Someone had maintained this place long before Mr. Halliwood's arrival. A maid passing along the lane slowed eagerly. Pretty again, isn't it, miss? Yes, Miss Marple said kindly. It seems never to have been entirely neglected. The girl hesitated, clearly torn between caution and gossip. Well, she whispered, old Mr. Carter, he used to say he saw lantern lights there some nights. Years ago. Thought it was smugglers or ghosts. She giggled nervously. But someone must have had keys. Miss Marple thanked her and continued walking, her thoughts settling into quiet order. A maintained empty house suggested expectation. Preparation. Waiting. After supper, Mrs. Morton shared yet another piece of gossip while arranging biscuits. Several families were close to the Ashcombes once, she said. The Lintons especially. Practically lived there. How pleasant, Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Morton hesitated. Not entirely pleasant by the end. Outside, wind brushed softly against the windows. Miss Marple sat back, folding her hands in her lap. Villages, she reflected, rarely forgot scandals. They merely softened them with time until someone returned who remembered too clearly. She considered Mrs. Linton's trembling hands, Dr. Reeves's hurried certainty, Mr. Halliwood's careful observation of faces. The polished gate, the maintained garden. Not a reopening, then. A continuation. Someone had preserved Ashcombe House like evidence sealed in plain sight, and someone else was uneasy now that it had awakened. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself, the expression gentle enough to appear harmless to anyone watching. Yet behind it her thoughts moved with quiet precision. Houses did not keep secrets on their own. People did, and people, unlike buildings, grew nervous when old rooms were opened again. As night settled over Brackenshire, the lights of Ashcombe House burned steadily across the fields, bright and watchful. Miss Marple looked toward them from the sitting-room window and felt, with the calm certainty born of long experience, that the village was not merely remembering the past. It was bracing itself for its return, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly into the darkness, knew she had just seen the first shadow of murder. Chapter 2. The remark that began it all seemed harmless enough, spoken over teacups and lemon cake, yet it lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts long after the words themselves had faded. It came from Mrs. Penbury, who possessed the particular talent, common in villages, of delivering alarming information in the tone one might use to discuss weather. "Of course," she said lightly, adjusting her hatpins at the church charity tea, "houses remember quarrels better than happiness. That is why some rooms always feel cold." The ladies around her laughed politely, but Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Linton did not laugh at all. Instead, she reached for her teacup and discovered her hand was trembling just enough to rattle the spoon against porcelain. Miss Marple, seated nearby, appeared absorbed in arranging sugar cubes, though she missed nothing. The church hall smelled pleasantly of baked scones and polished wood. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating small groups gathered in familiar arrangements, widows beside widows, gardeners near the door, respectable gossip flowing as steadily as tea. Such gatherings, Miss Marple often reflected, were the true archives of English life. Secrets rarely survived long where cakes were served generously. The reopening of Ashcombe House dominated conversation. "I saw lamps in the west wing past midnight," whispered Mrs. Penbury to no one in particular. "Quite unsettling. That part was always closed, even before." "Workmen," suggested someone. "No workmen stay past midnight," another replied. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. Villages required very little encouragement to become imaginative, yet imagination often circled truth without realizing it. Across the room stood Mr. Adrian Hallowwood, speaking politely with the vicar. He listened more than he spoke, his posture relaxed but attentive. Miss Marple observed how his gaze occasionally drifted across the gathering, not idly, but deliberately, pausing upon certain individuals. When his eyes settled briefly on Mrs. Linton, she turned away at once, pretending sudden interest in a raffle basket. Curious, Miss Marple thought. She rose slowly and joined a nearby conversation where Dr. Reeves was explaining the importance of fresh air. "A village is fortunate to have such healthy surroundings," Miss Marple said gently. "Indeed," Dr. Reeves replied. "Very peaceful. Nothing dramatic ever occurs here." His tone was firm, too firm for so ordinary a statement. Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of perspiration along his temple despite the cool day. "I understand there was once an unfortunate accident at Ashcombe House," she added mildly. The doctor stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, quite unfortunate. A fall. Entirely accidental." "How sad," Miss Marple murmured. "Young people are so full of life. One never expects such things." He nodded quickly and excused himself with surprising haste. Miss Marple watched him go. People eager to end conversations often feared where they might lead. Soon afterward, Mrs. Penbury leaned closer again, unable to resist further disclosure. "Clara Ashcombe," she whispered. "Beautiful girl. Too spirited," some said. She fell from the balcony after an argument. Though no one agreed about whom she argued with, Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Disagreements are rarely remembered clearly when they embarrass families. Mrs. Penbury's eyes sparkled. "Exactly." At that moment, Mr. Hallowwood approached their table. "I hope the tea is satisfactory," he said politely. "Very much so," Miss Marple replied. "Villages do tea exceedingly well." He smiled faintly, yet there was tension beneath it. "I understand you have taken great interest in local history," she added. "History explains people," he said after a pause. "And people explain everything else." His words were simple, but Miss Marple detected weight behind them. Not casual curiosity, intention. "And Ashcombe House has much history?" she asked. He met her gaze steadily, more than most realize. Before she could respond, another guest interrupted him. As he turned away, Miss Marple noticed something peculiar. He carried no teacup, though he had been offered one several times. His hands remained free, as though he preferred readiness over comfort. A small detail, perhaps, yet habits revealed character. Later, while helping tidy plates, Miss Marple found herself beside the young maid from Ashcombe House, a cheerful girl named Elsie, who clearly longed to share information. "It's grand inside now," Elsie whispered. "But strange, too." "In what way?" Miss Marple asked kindly. "Well, Sir spends hours in the attic. Boxes of old letters everywhere. Says they must be sorted proper." "Letters are important," Miss Marple said. "They preserve memories." Elsie nodded eagerly. "And he keeps asking about people in the village. Who visited before? Who argued with Miss Clara? Who owed money and such?" Miss Marple's hands paused over a plate. "How very interesting." "So he is learning about old friendships," she said lightly. "Yes, miss, though some folks don't like being asked." Outside the hall, bells chimed softly as the afternoon ended. Villagers departed in clusters, voices lowered, glances exchanged. Miss Marple walked slowly toward Elderberry Lane, enjoying the crisp air. Ahead, she saw Mrs. Linton walking briskly, almost hurriedly, despite claiming earlier to feel unwell. As Mrs. Linton passed Ashcombe House, she deliberately crossed to the opposite side of the road without looking at it. Avoidance, Miss Marple reflected, was often more revealing than curiosity. She paused near the gate again. Curtains shifted faintly inside an upstairs window. Someone was watching the lane. Moments later, Dr. Reeves approached from behind, clearly startled to find her there. "Admiring the architecture?" he asked. "Yes," she replied pleasantly. "Old houses hold remarkable memories." He forced a laugh. "Only bricks and timber." "Are they?" Miss Marple said softly. He hesitated, then said abruptly, "The past is best left alone." An odd statement, she thought, from a man of science. As dusk settled, lights appeared one by one within the house. Not randomly, but moving room to room, methodically, as though someone followed a planned route. Searching. That word came to her naturally. Someone was not settling into Ashcombe House. Someone was investigating it. Back at Mrs. Morton's home, supper conversation turned lively again. "You know," Mrs. Morton said thoughtfully, "the Ashcombes entertained constantly years ago. Half the village owed them favors." "Financial favors?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Morton hesitated. "Some, yes. Hard times followed after Clara died. Strange coincidences, really." Miss Marple folded her napkin carefully. "Debts, arguments, sudden deaths, a returning stranger asking questions. Outside, wind brushed the hedges, carrying faint sounds from across the fields. A distant door closing at Ashcombe House." Miss Marple gazed toward the dark silhouette visible beyond the trees. A pattern was forming, delicate yet unmistakable. Mr. Halliwood was not merely restoring a property. He was reopening conversations others wished forgotten, and several people in Brackenshire were deeply uncomfortable with that fact. She recalled Mrs. Linton's trembling hands, Dr. Reeves's urgency, the attic letters, the midnight lights. If one wished to uncover truth quietly, one might begin exactly as Mr. Halliwood had, with politeness, patience, and questions disguised as curiosity. But such investigations rarely remain safe for long. Miss Marple settled into her chair, expression serene, though her thoughts moved swiftly beneath the calm. Somewhere within Ashcombe House lay a story unfinished, and someone in the village was already afraid it might be told. As the evening deepened and the house lights burned steadily in the distance, Miss Marple felt certain of one thing. The reopening of Ashcombe House had not disturbed old memories by accident. It had summoned them deliberately. And before long, she suspected those memories would demand a far greater price than gossip. For the first time since her arrival, she wondered not whether tragedy had once occurred there, but whether it was quietly preparing to happen again. Chapter 3. The invitation arrived the following morning, delivered by hand in an envelope of heavy cream paper that seemed slightly too formal for village custom. Mrs. Morton brought it into the breakfast room with raised eyebrows, holding it as though it might contain either excellent news or mild scandal. "For you," she said. "From Ashcombe House." Miss Marple accepted it with polite surprise. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, every letter carefully shaped. Inside was a brief note from Mr. Adrian Halewood, inviting her to luncheon that very afternoon, expressing hope that she might share her impressions of Brackenshire and its history. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she folded the letter again. "How thoughtful," she said. Yet inwardly she reflected that invitations rarely came without purpose, particularly from men who asked many questions but revealed very little about themselves. The walk to Ashcombe House later that day was pleasant enough, though the sky carried a pale stillness that suggested approaching rain. Fallen leaves whispered beneath her shoes as she approached the iron gates. Up close, the house appeared less grand than dignified. Tall windows, ivy carefully restrained, stone steps newly cleaned. What struck her most, however, was order. Not the hurried order of recent repairs, but the quiet regularity of ongoing care. The brass knocker shone with long familiarity. The gravel path was evenly raked. Someone had loved maintenance here long before Mr. Hollywood's arrival. The door opened almost immediately, as if her approach had been observed. Mr. Hollywood greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, I am delighted you accepted." His tone was cordial, yet Miss Marple noticed a faint watchfulness behind his politeness, as though he measured reactions even while smiling. Inside, Ashcombe House carried the scent of lavender polish and old paper. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating furniture arranged with careful precision. Yet something felt subtly unfinished, as if certain pieces of the past had been removed. "I hope you forgive the disorder," he said. "I am still learning the house." Miss Marple glanced discreetly at the spotless hallway. "Houses teach their owners slowly," she replied. He laughed softly, though his eyes remained thoughtful. As he guided her through the rooms, Miss Marple observed small inconsistencies. Dust lay lightly upon several cabinets, yet door handles gleamed from frequent use. Curtains were newly cleaned, but carpets showed faint impressions of older furniture recently moved. In the drawing room, her gaze lingered on one wall where wallpaper appeared slightly lighter in a rectangular shape. "A portrait hung there once," she said casually. Mr. Halewood paused. "Yes, Clara Ashcombe, I believe." "Removed?" "For restoration," he replied quickly. Miss Marple inclined her head politely, though she noted the hesitation before his answer. They moved toward the study at the end of the corridor. Its door remained closed. Mr. Hollywood passed it without comment. Miss Marple slowed just enough to notice the key already inserted in the lock and the faint smell of fresh air drifting from beneath the door. Unlike the stillness elsewhere. "You keep busy rooms separate from finished ones," she remarked lightly. He glanced back, momentarily surprised. "I prefer order." A reasonable explanation, yet she sensed reluctance rather than preference. Luncheon was served in a smaller dining room overlooking the gardens. Conversation flowed easily, Mr. Hollywood asking gentle questions about village customs, long-standing friendships, and family histories. Miss Marple answered pleasantly, offering harmless anecdotes while observing how carefully he listened whenever certain names arose. Mrs. Linton's name produced the smallest tightening of his expression. Dr. Reeves's name made him glance briefly toward the window. Curiosity sharpened by purpose, Miss Marple thought. During dessert, a maid entered hurriedly carrying a stack of papers. "Beg pardon, sir. These were in the attic trunk." Mr. Hollywood rose at once, taking them quickly. Several envelopes slipped loose, scattering slightly before he gathered them again. Miss Marple saw aged handwriting, feminine and elegant. "Letters. I do apologize," he said. "Old correspondence. Quite tedious." "Not at all," Miss Marple said gently. "Letters often tell stories more honestly than memories." For a moment, he studied her closely, as though wondering how much she understood. After luncheon, he excused himself briefly, leaving her alone near the staircase. Miss Marple did not wander. She never intruded, yet observation required very little movement. From above came the faint sound of drawers opening, papers shifting, then footsteps pacing slowly back and forth. Searching again. When he returned, his composure had tightened slightly, as though whatever he had read confirmed rather than satisfied him. They toured the upper floor together. The balcony corridor stretched long and bright, overlooking the gardens below. Miss Marple paused there, resting her gloved hand lightly upon the railing. The wood felt newer than surrounding sections. "Recently repaired?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Necessary maintenance." She leaned slightly, examining the grain. The replacement piece matched carefully, but not perfectly. A break once existed here. Her gaze drifted downward to the lawn below. The height was considerable. "One must take care," she murmured. "Accidents occur quickly." Mr. Hellowood's voice lowered. Sometimes accidents are convenient explanations. The remark lingered between them. Before she could reply, footsteps approached. Mrs. Linton stood at the far end of the corridor, pale and rigid. "I did not realize you had visitors," she said, forcing a smile. Miss Marple noticed at once how her eyes avoided the balcony entirely. "I merely came to return a book," Mrs. Linton added hurriedly, holding out a volume. Mr. Hellowood accepted it calmly. "You are always welcome." Yet tension filled the air like approaching thunder. Mrs. Linton's gaze flickered briefly toward Miss Marple, measuring, uneasy, before she excused herself with surprising haste. After she left, silence remained. "She seems uncomfortable," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Some people dislike revisiting the past," Mr. Helwood replied. His tone held quiet significance. As Miss Marple prepared to depart later that afternoon, she paused again in the hallway. A faint draft moved from beneath the study door. She noticed fresh scratches near the keyhole, as though it had been opened frequently and hurriedly. Outside, the sky had darkened. Wind stirred the hedges as she walked back toward the village. Halfway down Elderberry Lane, she encountered Elsie the maid again. "Busy day at the house?" Miss Marple asked kindly. "Oh yes, miss. Sir hardly sleeps. Reads letters late into the night. Says answers must be somewhere." "Answers to what?" Elsie lowered her voice. "He keeps asking what Miss Clara was afraid of before she died." Miss Marple thanked her and continued walking slowly. Afraid. Not careless. Not unhappy. Afraid. By the time she reached Mrs. Morton's gate, rain had begun to fall softly, tapping against rooftops like quiet insistence. She sat by the window that evening, reflecting upon the day's observations, the locked study, the removed portrait, the repaired balcony, Mrs. Linton's fear, and Mr. Hellowood's relentless search through letters. Ashcombe House was not merely preserving memories. Someone was assembling evidence. And evidence suggested intention. Miss Marple folded her hands peacefully, her expression gentle, almost amused, though her thoughts had settled into firm clarity. If Mr. Hellowood sought truth, he was drawing dangerously close to it. And in villages, truth rarely remained harmless once uncovered. She looked toward the distant glow of Ashcombe House through the rain-dark fields and felt a quiet certainty form within her. The house was not hiding the past at all. Someone inside it was trying very carefully to rewrite it. And Miss Marple suspected that before long, the search for answers would awaken something far more dangerous than memory. Chapter 4. The news arrived before breakfast, carried not by letter or messenger, but by urgency itself. The hurried ringing of Mrs. Morton's front bell, sharp and repeated, the sort of sound that belonged only to illness, fire, or tragedy. Miss Marple was already awake, seated near the window with her tea, when the maid rushed past the door. Voices murmured in the hallway. A gasp followed. Then Mrs. Morton entered, pale and breathless, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "My dear," she said, struggling for composure, "there has been an accident at Ashcombe House." Miss Marple set down her cup carefully. The word accident settled heavily in the room, familiar yet already doubtful. "Mr. Hellowood," Mrs. Morton continued. "He was found in the garden this morning, beneath the balcony." For a moment neither woman spoke. Outside, morning sunlight shone with indifferent brightness, birds calling as though nothing at all had changed. Miss Marple rose slowly. Is he alive? Mrs. Morton shook her head. The walk toward Ashcombe House felt strangely quiet. Villagers gathered along Elderberry Lane in subdued clusters, voices lowered to whispers that rose and fell like wind through grass. I heard a fall in the night. They say he slipped. Same place as before. Imagine that. Miss Marple noticed how frequently people avoided finishing their sentences. At the gates stood Dr. Reeves, speaking to a constable while wiping his spectacles repeatedly, though they were already clean. His expression carried professional solemnity, yet beneath it lay unmistakable agitation. He saw Miss Marple approaching and forced a polite nod. "Terrible business," he said quickly. "A tragic accident." Miss Marple inclined her head. How very unfortunate. She allowed the word unfortunate to linger gently between them. The garden beyond felt unnaturally still. Dew clung to the grass, sparkling peacefully around the spot where Mr. Halliwood lay covered by a blanket. Two policemen stood nearby, speaking quietly. Miss Marple did not approach closely. She never intruded upon grief or official duties. Instead, she observed what others ignored. A chair rested near the balcony doors, positioned oddly, not facing outward toward the garden but angled sideways as though recently moved. One leg pressed deeper into the soil than the others. She noticed also that the balcony curtains above stirred faintly despite closed windows. Dr. Reeves cleared his throat behind her. "Instantaneous," he said. "He must have leaned too far." "Indeed?" she replied softly. "The railing is quite safe," he added hastily. "Recently repaired." Miss Marple's eyes lifted briefly toward the balcony. "Yes, repaired carefully. Strongly. Not the sort to fail under casual pressure." "How fortunate repairs were made," she said gently. The doctor did not answer. Mrs. Linton stood nearby among the villagers, wrapped tightly in a dark coat despite the mild morning. Her face appeared pale, yet Miss Marple noticed something curious. Relief mingled with shock, as though tension long endured had suddenly eased. When their eyes met, Mrs. Linton looked away at once. Inspector Grant, newly arrived from the nearby town, began asking questions. His tone remained courteous but brisk. "When was Mr. Halliwood last seen?" "Around 9 last evening," said a servant. "He dismissed us early." "Anyone visit afterward?" A pause followed. Mrs. Linton spoke carefully. "I delivered a book yesterday afternoon. Nothing more." Her voice sounded composed, yet Miss Marple detected a faint dryness, the voice of someone rehearsing simplicity. The inspector nodded and continued. Miss Marple wandered slowly along the garden edge, appearing merely thoughtful. Near the stone path she noticed faint scuff marks in the soil, partially disturbed by morning footsteps. Two distinct impressions suggested movement, not a fall alone, but a brief struggle. She said nothing. Instead, she observed the balcony again. Sunlight revealed a slight irregularity in the railing, a polished section where hands might recently have gripped tightly. Nearby, Elsie the maid stood trembling. "Such a terrible thing," the girl whispered when Miss Marple approached. "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Was Mr. Halliwood troubled lately?" Elsie hesitated. "He argued with someone yesterday evening. I heard voices upstairs." "A man's voice?" "No, miss, a lady's." Miss Marple nodded gently, offering reassurance before moving away. Inside the house, the atmosphere felt altered. Where yesterday there had been purpose, now there was absence. Papers lay scattered in the study, drawers partly open. Inspector Grant examined the room while speaking aloud. "Looks like he was working late." Miss Marple's gaze fell upon the desk. Several envelopes lay arranged neatly, yet one space remained empty, a gap suggesting something recently removed. Not theft, she thought. Selection. She noticed also a teacup untouched beside the papers, its surface cold, the tea scarcely sipped. A man expecting company, perhaps. The inspector turned to her politely. "You visited yesterday, I understand?" "Yes." "Did Mr. Halliwood seem distressed, determined?" she replied after a moment. Not distressed. Inspector Grant considered this thoughtfully. Outside again, gossip swelled among villagers. They say the house is cursed. Same balcony. Imagine the coincidence. Perhaps history repeats itself. Miss Marple listened quietly. Villages preferred superstition to discomforting truth. As afternoon approached, Mrs. Penberry whispered confidentially beside her, "He had meetings planned, you know. Asked several people to call upon him this week." "How interesting," Miss Marple said. "Yes, about old matters." Very serious tone. Miss Marple folded her hands. A man investigating the past dies exactly where the past once claimed another life. Too neat, too symmetrical. Later, while the constables measured distances, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Linton watching from the edge of the lawn. Her gaze remained fixed, not on the body, but on the balcony door above. Fear, not grief. When Mrs. Linton realized she was being observed, she quickly turned away and began speaking loudly about the weather. Miss Marple's thoughts settled slowly into alignment. 2 deaths. Same place. Same explanation offered immediately. Accident. Yet accidents did not rearrange chairs, produce arguments, or leave signs of resistance. As evening approached, the body was taken away, and the crowd dispersed reluctantly, conversations continuing in hushed tones along the lane. Miss Marple walked home beneath a sky turning amber with sunset. The village appeared unchanged, smoke rising from chimneys, children laughing distantly. Yet beneath the calm lay unmistakable unease. At supper, Mrs. Morton whispered, "Surely it cannot be coincidence." Miss Marple stirred her soup thoughtfully. "Coincidences," she said gently, "are often truths waiting patiently for proper attention." She recalled Mr. Hailwood's words on the balcony, "Sometimes accidents are convenient explanations." Yes, convenient indeed. Someone had feared what he discovered, and someone had ensured he would reveal nothing further. Later that night, Miss Marple sat by the window once more, gazing toward Ashcombe House, now dark except for a single upstairs lamp left burning by the police. The house seemed watchful again, holding its silence carefully. 2 falls separated by 20 years. The same height. The same story. But human behavior, she reflected, rarely changed so perfectly unless guided by memory or guilt. Miss Marple smiled faintly, though sadness touched her expression. Somewhere within Brackenshire walked a person who had already escaped consequence once. And when fear returned, that person had chosen the same solution again. As the wind stirred softly through Elderberry Lane, Miss Marple felt certainty settle quietly in her mind. The second fall had not been an accident. It had been a silencing. And whoever had pushed Mr. Hollywood believed, quite wrongly, that the truth had fallen with him. Chapter 5. The morning after the tragedy brought an unusual stillness to Brackenshire, the kind that followed excitement rather than preceded it. Curtains twitched more frequently along the lane, conversations paused when footsteps approached, and even the postman lingered longer than necessary at garden gates. Miss Marple noticed these changes immediately, for villages, like people, betrayed emotion through small habits rather than dramatic gestures. It was Mrs. Morton who introduced the morning's most interesting piece of gossip while pouring tea. "They say the inspector is searching through old papers at Ashcombe House," she said. "Boxes upon boxes of letters. Imagine keeping correspondence for so many years." Miss Marple buttered her toast thoughtfully. "Letters are rarely kept without reason," she said. "They comfort memory or defend against it." Mrs. Morton blinked at this but nodded solemnly, as though such wisdom were entirely expected. By late morning, Miss Marple found herself invited, unofficially but warmly, to visit Ashcombe House again. Inspector Grant, having learned of her previous acquaintance with Mr. Hailwood, welcomed any assistance she might provide regarding village history. He was a practical man, not dismissive of quiet intelligence when he encountered it. The house felt different now. Not merely quieter, but interrupted. Chairs stood slightly displaced, doors half open, the atmosphere carrying the faint chill of unfinished conversation. In the study, sunlight fell across stacks of letters arranged carefully upon a long table. Inspector Grant stood beside them, sleeves rolled, spectacles low upon his nose. "Extraordinary collection," he said. Mr. Halewood appears to have been cataloging everything connected to the former owners. Miss Marple approached slowly, her eyes moving gently across the papers without touching them at first. The handwriting varied, invitations, personal notes, receipts, and longer private letters tied neatly with fading ribbons. Domestic history preserved in ink. "He was thorough," she murmured. "More than thorough," the inspector replied. "Almost investigative." Miss Marple selected one letter the inspector offered. The paper had yellowed, yet the script remained elegant and firm. Clara Ashcombe's hand. She read quietly. The early letters spoke of village gatherings, music evenings, and ordinary pleasures. Yet as dates progressed, the tone changed. Sentences shortened. Words grew cautious. One passage caught her attention. "I begin to feel watched even in my own home. Someone knows more than they should." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but inwardly her thoughts sharpened. Fear again. Not carelessness, not despair. Fear. Inspector Grant observed her carefully. "Does anything strike you?" "Only that Miss Ashcombe trusted someone she later doubted," Miss Marple said gently. He nodded. "We also discovered legal documents. Financial matters." He handed her another paper, a loan agreement bearing Mrs. Linton's family name. Miss Marple read silently. A substantial sum borrowed shortly before Clara's death. "How unfortunate," she said softly. "Debt causes strain," the inspector replied, "but not murder." Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she noticed a detail others might ignore. Several letters arranged apart from the rest, their edges more worn, as though frequently handled recently rather than preserved for decades. "Mr. Halewood read these often?" she asked. "Yes," said the inspector. Servants confirmed it. She opened one carefully. "If anything happens to me," Clara had written, "it will not be chance. I have quarreled with someone I once called a friend." Miss Marple folded the letter slowly. Outside the study window, Mrs. Linton crossed the garden path, speaking anxiously with Dr. Reeves. Their conversation ceased the moment they noticed anyone looking. A shared tension passed between them, brief yet unmistakable. Miss Marple returned her attention to the desk. A faint rectangular gap remained among the papers. "One letter is missing," she observed. Inspector Grant frowned. "You're certain?" "The arrangement suggests completion," she said mildly. "People who organize carefully dislike gaps." He made a note at once. A missing letter suggested knowledge someone wished removed recently. As they continued examining documents, another discovery emerged. Among legal papers lay proof of Mr. Halewood's identity under a previous surname. The inspector read aloud quietly. "Adrian Hale, formerly registered as Adrian Ashcombe." Miss Marple felt no surprise. "He was family," she said. "Yes. Illegitimate son, according to these records. Raised elsewhere." The inspector leaned back thoughtfully. "So he returns years later, buys the house secretly, investigates his mother's death, and begins asking questions," Miss Marple finished gently. The pattern settled into place with quiet inevitability. Mr. Halewood had not come to restore property. He had come seeking justice. A soft knock interrupted them. Elsie entered nervously carrying tea. "He worked late every night," she said suddenly, unable to contain herself. Said truth was nearly clear. Said someone would have to answer at last. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Did he expect visitors the night he died?" Elsie hesitated. "Yes, miss. He told me to prepare the drawing room earlier. Said an important conversation was coming." Inspector Grant exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. An arranged meeting. Not an accident. After leaving the study, Miss Marple wandered briefly through the corridor. Her gaze rested upon the balcony doors again. Daylight revealed faint scratches near the handle, marks of hurried gripping. She imagined the scene quietly. Confrontation, accusation, panic. Downstairs voices rose as villagers gathered once more, drawn by curiosity stronger than discretion. Mrs. Penberry whispered eagerly. He was asking everyone about money troubles years ago. Quite improper, really. Improper questions often lead to proper answers, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Penberry blinked at this, uncertain whether to agree. Outside, Mrs. Linton stood alone near the garden wall. Miss Marple approached slowly. "A sad time for the village," she said kindly. "Yes," Mrs. Linton replied quickly. "Terribly sad." Her voice carried strain. She clasped her gloves tightly, twisting the fabric unconsciously. "Mr. Halewood seemed very determined," Miss Marple added. Mrs. Linton's eyes flickered. Some people cannot leave the past alone. "Perhaps the past refuses to leave them," Miss Marple suggested softly. Mrs. Linton said nothing further, and soon excused herself. Miss Marple watched her go, noting the hurried pace, the refusal to glance back at the balcony. Fear again. That evening, back at Mrs. Morton's home, the pieces arranged themselves gently in Miss Marple's thoughts. Clara Ashcombe feared someone close. A financial debt connected Clara and Mrs. Linton. Mr. Hollywood discovered the truth and arranged a meeting. One letter disappeared, and two deaths now mirrored each other perfectly. Miss Marple folded her hands, her expression peaceful, though certainty grew stronger. Desperation, she reflected, often appeared respectable in villages. It wore polite smiles, attended church teas, and spoke kindly of neighbors until threatened. Then it acted swiftly. Outside, twilight settled across Brackenshire, and Ashcombe House stood dark against the fading sky, its windows reflecting only memory. Mr. Halewood had come seeking justice for his mother, and someone, long protected by time and silence, had realized he was about to succeed. Miss Marple gazed toward the distant house and felt a quiet sadness. The murderer had escaped once through politeness and denial. But this time, the house itself seemed unwilling to forget, and Miss Marple suspected that the missing letter, wherever it now lay, contained the final truth someone had killed twice to keep hidden. Chapter 6. The change in the village became unmistakable by the following afternoon. Brackenshire no longer whispered merely out of curiosity. Now, it whispered out of caution. Doors closed more quickly, conversations softened when strangers passed, and even the church bell seemed to ring with unusual restraint, as though aware that harmony had been disturbed. Miss Marple noticed it most clearly during her morning walk. People greeted her warmly, yet each greeting carried a question unspoken. What truly happened at Ashcombe House? Villages possessed a collective instinct for truth, even when individuals preferred not to face it. The first revealing moment arrived outside the baker's shop. Mrs. Penberry stood near the window, speaking in urgent tones to another lady. Upon seeing Miss Marple, she lowered her voice, though not nearly enough. "They say Inspector Grant is asking about old debts now," she whispered. "Imagine bringing up matters from 20 years ago." Miss Marple paused politely. "Financial matters have long memories," she said. Mrs. Penberry leaned closer, delighted. Well, Clara Ashcombe was generous. Perhaps too generous. Helped several families quietly. Some never fully recovered after she died. "How very sad," Miss Marple replied. But what interested her was not the gossip itself, but the discomfort surrounding it. Debt created obligation. An obligation created resentment when gratitude faded. As she left the shop, she saw Dr. Reeves emerging from the post office. He appeared startled to encounter her, adjusting his hat with unnecessary haste. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said. "Dreadful business still weighing on everyone." "Yes," she agreed gently. "Such events remind us how closely lives intertwine." He nodded quickly. "Quite so." Entirely tragic. His tone carried impatience, as though wishing the subject buried. Miss Marple noticed how he avoided mentioning Mr. Halewood by name. "Did you know Miss Ashcombe well?" she asked mildly. He hesitated, only a fraction of a second, yet enough. "We were acquaintances," he said. "Nothing more." "And the evening she died?" "A terrible accident," he said sharply, then softened his voice. "Forgive me. One grows tired of revisiting sorrow." Miss Marple inclined her head kindly, though inwardly she marked the defensiveness carefully. People grew weary of lies far more quickly than of grief. Later that afternoon, she visited the church garden, where Mrs. Linton often supervised flower arrangements. The woman stood among roses, clipping stems with unnecessary precision. "How peaceful it must be here," Miss Marple remarked. "Yes," Mrs. Linton said quickly. "Peaceful things should remain undisturbed." Miss Marple watched her hands. The scissors trembled slightly each time the conversation neared Ashcombe House. "Mr. Hollywood seemed fond of the village," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Linton's shoulders stiffened. "He asked too many questions. Curiosity is natural when one returns to family history." The scissors stopped mid-air. "Family?" Mrs. Linton repeated. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, did you not know?" Color drained faintly from Mrs. Linton's face before she turned away, pretending to examine flowers. A revealing reaction. "I believe he wished only to understand his mother," Miss Marple added softly. Mrs. Linton dropped a rose stem. It fell soundlessly onto the grass. For several moments neither woman spoke. Finally, Mrs. Linton said, "Some truths do more harm than good." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Only when they arrive too late." Mrs. Linton excused herself almost immediately afterward, leaving the garden with hurried steps. Miss Marple remained among the roses, reflecting. Fear now guided Mrs. Linton's behavior. Not shock, not mourning. Fear of exposure. That evening, Inspector Grant called upon Mrs. Morton's house. He appeared thoughtful rather than frustrated, which Miss Marple considered promising. "I have statements from several villagers," he said over tea. "Most claim Mr. Hollywood intended private meetings regarding Miss Ashcombe's death." "And did he meet anyone that evening?" Miss Marple asked. "One servant reports a visitor shortly after 9. "A woman?" Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Did the visitor leave by the front entrance?" "No one saw," the inspector admitted, "yet footprints near the side path suggest someone departed in haste." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. "Haste often follows unexpected developments," she said. The inspector leaned forward. "You believe this was deliberate?" She met his gaze calmly. "I believe repetition is rarely accidental." He nodded slowly. After he departed, Miss Marple walked briefly outside. Night air carried the scent of damp earth, and Ashcombe House stood faintly illuminated in the distance, guarded now by police presence. She thought of Clara Ashcombe's letters, fear growing slowly, arguments remembered imperfectly, friendships strained by money and pride. Desperation rarely appeared dramatic at first. It began quietly, disguised as necessity. The next morning brought another small but telling detail. Elsie the maid arrived at Mrs. Morton's door, nervous and eager. "I remembered something, miss," she said. "About the night Mr. Hollywood died." Miss Marple invited her inside. "He told me earlier that day," Elsie whispered, "that someone had lied for 20 years. Said he finally had proof." Miss Marple felt certainty deepen. "Did he say who?" "No, miss. Only that the person would come to speak with him whether they wished to or not. A summons, then, not a quarrel begun by chance." After the girl left, Miss Marple sat quietly, reviewing each piece again. Clara argues with a trusted friend. Clara falls. Debt disappears afterward. Years later, her son returns with evidence. A meeting arranged. Fear revived. Another fall. Her thoughts moved gently but firmly toward conclusion, though one element still troubled her. Intention. Had the second death been planned murder? Or panic, repeating an old mistake? That distinction mattered greatly to Miss Marple, for human weakness often proved more tragic than cruelty. In the afternoon, she returned briefly to Ashcombe House, escorted by Inspector Grant. Standing again upon the balcony, she examined the repaired railing closely. Her fingers traced the polished wood. 2 points of pressure lay faintly visible, spaced as though hands had braced violently against resistance. Not leaning. Struggling. She imagined voices raised, accusations spoken quietly but firmly, denial turning to fear. A push born not from calculation, but desperation. Miss Marple sighed softly. "The past," she said aloud, "is very patient." Inspector Grant glanced at her. Meaning, it waits until someone can no longer bear remembering alone. As they descended the stairs, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Linton standing outside the gate below, watching the house with fixed intensity before quickly turning away when she saw them. Avoidance again. Always avoidance. That evening, Miss Marple sat beside the fire, hands folded peacefully. The pattern was complete now, only confirmation remained. The motive was painfully ordinary. Money, pride, fear of disgrace, not hatred. Respectability preserved at terrible cost. She felt no triumph in the realization, only quiet sorrow. For years, a woman had lived beneath the weight of a moment's panic, believing it buried safely in time, and now the past had returned in the form of a son seeking truth. Miss Marple looked toward the dark silhouette of Ashcombe House and knew the end approached. Someone in Brackenshire had killed once in desperation, and when confronted with truth, that same desperation had guided their hands again. The house remembered everything, and very soon, she suspected, it would force its final confession. Chapter 7. The village awoke beneath a pale gray sky, the sort that pressed gently upon rooftops and encouraged quiet reflection. By now, Brackenshire had settled into that peculiar calm which follows shock. Outward normality carefully restored, while unease lingered beneath every polite greeting. Milk bottles stood neatly at doors, curtains opened on schedule, and yet conversations still paused whenever Ashcombe House was mentioned. Miss Marple sensed the change immediately. The gossip had shifted. No longer curious, it had become cautious, almost defensive, as though the village itself feared what might soon be spoken aloud. The morning's first remark came from Mrs. Morton while arranging flowers. "Mrs. Linton did not attend church committee yesterday," she said. "Quite unlike her." Miss Marple adjusted a small rose thoughtfully. Absence often suggests preoccupation. Mrs. Morton lowered her voice. "People say she has not slept." Miss Marple nodded gently, but made no comment. Sleeplessness, she knew, was rarely caused by grief alone. Guilt kept far stricter hours. Later that day, she accepted Inspector Grant's request to revisit Ashcombe House once more. The inspector had reached the stage familiar to investigators, facts gathered, yet meaning not fully settled. "I cannot prove how the fall occurred," he admitted as they walked through the hall. No witness. No direct evidence. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Houses sometimes provide quieter testimony. He looked puzzled, but allowed her to proceed. The house felt heavy with stillness, its rooms holding echoes of unfinished conversations. Sunlight fell across the staircase exactly as it must have years earlier, unchanged by time. Miss Marple moved slowly, pausing at small details others overlooked. A table slightly misaligned with the rug. A vase turned inward rather than outward. Signs not of disorder, but of movement interrupted. She stopped outside the study. "May we begin here?" she asked. Inside, the letters remained carefully catalogued. Inspector Grant had arranged them chronologically, revealing Clara Ashcombe's growing distress with startling clarity. Miss Marple read silently once more, her attention lingering on recurring phrases, misunderstanding, pressure, "I cannot help further." "She grows desperate." "She," Miss Marple repeated softly. Inspector Grant leaned closer. "You believe Clara argued with a woman?" "Yes. Someone familiar enough to visit freely. Someone in difficulty." They left the study and climbed the stairs together. Miss Marple walked slowly, counting steps unconsciously, noting sightlines between doors and corridor turns. At the balcony, she paused again. Wind brushed lightly against the railing. Below, the garden lay peaceful, betraying nothing of violence. Miss Marple placed her gloved hands upon the wood exactly where she imagined another pair once had been. "Inspector," she said gently, "would you stand here, please?" He obeyed, positioning himself near the doors. "Now imagine," she continued calmly, "a conversation. Quiet at first. Accusations spoken politely. Evidence presented. She turns slightly toward him. The visitor denies it. Fear rises. She realizes exposure is inevitable. Reputation destroyed. Years of respectability lost. Inspector Grant watched her closely. She attempts to leave. Miss Marple continued. He steps forward, perhaps not aggressively, merely insisting she listen. She moved one step nearer the railing. She retreats until there is nowhere left to retreat. Her hand pressed lightly against the wood. Panic does the rest. The inspector exhaled slowly. A push. Not planned, Miss Marple said softly. Repeated. He frowned. Repeated? She gestured toward the repaired section of railing. The same position as before. Clara stood here years ago. The house remembers patterns even when people try to forget them. They descended again in silence. Outside, Elsie waited anxiously near the kitchen entrance. I remembered something else, she said quickly. The night Miss Clara died, my mother worked here then. She said Mrs. Linton visited often that week. They argued about money. Inspector Grant stiffened. Why was this not reported? Elsie hesitated. No one wished scandal, sir. The village decided it was kinder to call it an accident. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Kindness, she reflected, often disguised avoidance. As they walked toward the garden, another detail caught her attention. Near the side path, faint impressions remained preserved beneath gravel, older marks uncovered during recent rain. Two sets of footprints overlapping. One advancing, one retreating. She said nothing immediately, allowing the inspector to observe them himself. He looked up slowly. Someone backed away. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. Fear moves backward. They returned indoors, where afternoon light softened the rooms. Miss Marple paused near the entrance hall mirror. Its surface reflected the staircase and balcony beyond. A sudden realization settled fully into place. Position. Movement. Habit. Mrs. Linton never looked toward the balcony because she remembered exactly where she had stood. Miss Marple turned calmly to the inspector. I believe it is time to gather everyone, she said. That evening invitations were quietly delivered. Villagers arrived at Ashcombe House with solemn curiosity, assembling in the drawing room where lamps cast warm light against shadowed walls. Mrs. Linton arrived last. She appeared composed but pale, her eyes moving quickly about the room before settling anywhere except the balcony doors. Miss Marple sat comfortably near the fireplace, hands folded, her expression gentle enough to soothe rather than accuse. Conversations faded as she began speaking. It is curious, she said warmly, how villages protect one another. Out of kindness, unpleasant truths are softened, accidents accepted, questions avoided. No one interrupted. Years ago, she continued, a young woman stood upon this balcony after a quarrel with someone she trusted. That person faced financial ruin and begged for help. Mrs. Linton's breathing quickened almost imperceptibly. Clara Ashcombe refused further assistance, Miss Marple said softly. Not unkindly, merely firmly. Desperation turned to panic. A push followed, and the village chose silence rather than scandal. The room grew utterly still. Inspector Grant watched Mrs. Linton closely. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, almost sympathetic. 20 years passed. Respectability rebuilt itself. Until Clara's son returned, determined to understand his mother's death. Mrs. Linton's hands trembled visibly now. He invited a conversation here, Miss Marple continued. He presented proof, and once again, fear overcame reason. A tear slipped down Mrs. Linton's cheek, "I didn't mean," she whispered, stopping herself. Miss Marple looked at her kindly, not triumphantly. "Panic repeats familiar actions," she said, "especially when guilt has waited too long." Silence deepened around them. Mrs. Linton covered her face. "I only meant to stop him talking," she said faintly. "He wouldn't listen. He kept saying everyone would know." Inspector Grant stepped forward quietly. Miss Marple lowered her gaze gently, offering dignity even in exposure. Outside, evening settled over Ashcombe House, wind moving softly through trees that had witnessed both tragedies. The house had remembered everything. And as Miss Marple sat peacefully among the gathered villagers, she knew the final truth no longer hid within walls or letters. It had finally found its voice, carried not by accusation, but by memory itself. And yet, even as confession trembled in the air, she sensed the story had one final moment left before peace could truly return. Chapter 8. The gathering at Ashcombe House began in near silence, the kind that settled over a room when everyone sensed that ordinary conversation would no longer suffice. Lamps glowed warmly against the paneled walls, casting gentle shadows that softened faces yet could not ease the tension beneath them. Outside, evening descended slowly upon Brackenshire, and the old house seemed to wait, patient, attentive, as though aware that its long-held memories were finally about to be spoken aloud. Miss Marple sat comfortably near the fireplace, her posture relaxed, her hands folded lightly in her lap. She appeared, to any casual observer, merely an elderly lady invited for tea. Yet her calm presence held the room together more firmly than authority ever could. Inspector Grant stood quietly nearby, allowing events to unfold in her manner rather than his own. Villagers filled the chairs and lined the walls, Mrs. Penbury whispering nervously behind gloved fingers, Dr. Reeves staring fixedly at the carpet, and Mrs. Morton watching with anxious sympathy. At the far end sat Mrs. Linton, pale but composed, her back straight with the fragile dignity of someone holding herself together by effort alone. The balcony doors remained closed behind her. Miss Marple allowed several moments to pass before speaking. She understood that truth required stillness before it could be heard. "It is a curious thing," she began gently, "how villages preserve harmony. We forgive small untruths because kindness feels more comfortable than confrontation. Yet sometimes kindness asks too much of memory." Her voice carried warmth rather than accusation, and slowly the room leaned toward her words. "Many years ago," she continued, "Clara Ashcombe lived in this house. She was generous, perhaps excessively so, and trusted her friends deeply. When someone she cared for faced financial ruin, she offered help repeatedly." Mrs. Linton's hands tightened in her lap. "But generosity has limits," Miss Marple said softly. Eventually, Miss Ashcombe refused further assistance. Not cruelly, simply because she recognized that continued help would solve nothing. A faint tremor passed through the listeners. That refusal led to an argument upon the balcony. Fear overcame reason. A desperate moment followed, and Clara Ashcombe fell. No one moved. Dr. Reeves closed his eyes briefly, as though hearing aloud what he had long suspected. The village, Miss Marple continued, chose peace over scandal. An accident was accepted. Lives continued. Respectability survived. She paused, letting compassion soften the weight of her words. For 20 years, the truth rested quietly, not forgotten, merely unspoken. Her gaze turned gently toward Mrs. Linton. Until her son returned, a murmur spread through the room. Mr. Adrian Halewood came not as a stranger, but as Clara's child. He purchased the house quietly and began examining letters, records, memories. He asked questions, polite questions, yet questions that reopened fear. Inspector Grant nodded slightly, recognizing the careful progression. Miss Marple continued, her tone unchanged. He discovered debts erased after Clara's death. He learned of quarrels witnessed but never reported. And finally, he found proof that the fall had not been accidental. Mrs. Linton's breathing grew audible now. "He invited a conversation here," Miss Marple said. "Not revenge, only truth. He wished acknowledgement. She turned slightly, including everyone in the room. But guilt, when carried too long, becomes unbearable when exposed. And so, when confronted upon that same balcony, panic returned exactly as before. Her words fell softly yet unmistakably. The same fear, the same movement backward, the same desperate push. Mrs. Linton's composure broke at last. Her shoulders sagged, and tears slipped silently down her face. "I never meant to kill him," she whispered. "I only wanted him to stop saying he would tell everyone." No one spoke. Even Mrs. Penberry remained silent, shock outweighing curiosity. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "You lived many years believing silence had protected you," she said gently. "But silence asks a price. Mr. Halliwood did not threaten cruelty, only truth." Mrs. Linton nodded weakly. "I thought my life would end, everything ruined, everyone knowing." Inspector Grant stepped forward quietly, his voice respectful rather than harsh. "Mrs. Linton, I must ask you to come with me." She rose slowly, dignity returning in small measure now that resistance had ended. Before leaving, she turned toward Miss Marple. "I tried to forget," she said faintly. Miss Marple's expression held only compassion. "Forgetting is rarely within our control. Remembering honestly is." The inspector guided her gently from the room. The front door closed softly behind them, and for several moments no one moved. Outside, carriage wheels faded into the distance. The tension dissolved gradually, replaced by a subdued sadness. Villagers spoke in low voices, grappling with the collapse of long-held assumptions. Dr. Reeves approached Miss Marple quietly. "We all suspected, yet none of us wished to know." "Yes," she replied. "That is often the way with communities. Truth can feel unkind, until it restores peace. One by one, the guests departed, leaving Ashcombe House quiet once more. Lamps flickered softly as evening deepened into night. Miss Marple remained behind briefly, standing near the balcony doors. She opened them slightly and stepped out into the cool air. The garden lay peaceful beneath moonlight. No trace remained of violence, only stillness and the faint scent of autumn leaves. She rested her hand lightly upon the repaired railing. "How strange," she murmured softly, "that places remember what people cannot bear to." The house had witnessed desperation twice, patience lasting longer than guilt. Yet now, at last, its story stood complete. Inspector Grant returned a few minutes later. "She confessed fully," he said. "Your understanding of people is remarkable." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People rarely change as much as they believe. Circumstances merely reveal what already exists." They walked together toward the gate. Behind them, Ashcombe House stood calm, its windows reflecting moonlight instead of secrets. For the first time since her arrival, Miss Marple felt the tension surrounding it lift, as though the building itself had exhaled. On the lane outside, night sounds resumed naturally. Distant owls, rustling hedges, the ordinary music of village life continuing. "Will the village recover?" the inspector asked. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Villages always do. They remember briefly, then return to kindness. Only now, perhaps, with clearer understanding." She paused once more to look back. The balcony appeared harmless in the moonlight, merely wood and stone. Yet she knew how easily ordinary places became stages for human weakness. "Truth," she said softly, almost to herself, "is rather like light. One may close curtains for a time, but morning arrives regardless." As she walked home along Elderberry Lane, calm settled comfortably around her. The mystery had ended not with triumph, but with quiet resolution. Justice tempered by sympathy. Ashcombe House would remain, holding its memories without accusation. And Miss Marple, smiling gently beneath the starlit sky, knew that peace had finally returned to Brackenshire. Because the house that remembered everything had, at last, been heard. The days that followed settled gently over Brackenshire, as though the village itself wished to restore balance after holding its breath for too long. Life resumed in familiar rhythms, shop doors opened at their usual hour, the church bell rang with steady confidence, and neighbors once again paused at garden gates to exchange ordinary news about weather and roses rather than tragedy. Ashcombe House stood quietly at the end of Elderberry Lane, no longer watched with uneasy curiosity. Its windows reflected morning sunlight instead of whispered speculation, and the police presence soon faded, leaving only the soft creak of branches and the distant call of birds. Workmen arrived briefly to secure rooms and catalog belongings, moving respectfully through spaces that had witnessed more emotion than they could ever understand. Miss Marple continued her visit with Mrs. Morton, taking morning walks and afternoon tea as before, yet she sensed the subtle change within the village. People spoke more gently to one another. Old grievances seemed less important. Truth, once revealed, had lifted an invisible weight no one had fully recognized. Mrs. Penberry, naturally, attempted to discuss the matter frequently, though her tone softened whenever Miss Marple listened. Even gossip, it seemed, had learned restraint. Dr. Reeves grew quieter but kinder in conversation, as though relieved of a burden carried silently for years. And though Mrs. Linton's absence was deeply felt, there was little anger spoken against her, only a subdued sadness for a life shaped by one desperate moment and many years of fear. One afternoon, Miss Marple walked alone to the gates of Ashcombe House before her departure from Brackenshire. Autumn sunlight rested warmly upon the stone walls, and fallen leaves gathered along the path. The house appeared peaceful now, almost ordinary, its long silence finally free from tension. She stood there for some time, reflecting. Human lives, she thought, were rarely defined by wickedness alone. More often, tragedy began with small choices made under pressure, pride, fear, embarrassment. Feelings so ordinary, they seemed harmless until they were not. Clara Ashcombe had trusted too deeply, Mrs. Linton had feared disgrace too greatly, and Adrian Hallowwood had sought truth with courage that arrived many years too late. Yet justice, though delayed, had come quietly in the end. Miss Marple rested her hand lightly upon the gate, smiling faintly. Houses did not truly remember, of course, people did. Memories lingered in gestures, silences, avoided glances. The house had merely waited until someone was willing to see clearly. A breeze stirred the trees, carrying the scent of approaching winter. Somewhere in the distance, children laughed, their voices bright and untroubled. Turning away at last, Miss Marple began her slow walk back toward the village. Peace had returned not because sorrow had been erased, but because truth had been allowed its proper place. And as Ashcombe House faded behind her, calm and watchful beneath the afternoon sky, Miss Marple felt certain that Brackenshire would remember this lesson gently, that secrets may sleep for years, but sooner or later, kindness itself demands honesty. With that comforting thought, she continued down Elderberry Lane, leaving behind a village restored, a mystery finished, and a house that, at last, needed to remember nothing more.